Hi everyone. One of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in medieval England was the Kingdom of Mercia, but there's a theory that actually it wasn't an Anglo-Saxon kingdom at all. In fact, according to this theory, it was founded by the Vandals. Now, the Vandals were Germanic, but they weren't Anglo-Saxons. They were a Germanic kingdom who, for many years, had resided in North Africa, but then in the 6th century, they were defeated and they disappeared from history. So according to this theory, after their defeat in North Africa, they didn't just disappear, they migrated to Britain. They invaded and they founded the Kingdom of Mercia. And that's why Mercia was so distinct from the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, because it wasn't actually Anglo-Saxon at all. So where does this theory come from? What's the basis for it, and does it stand up to scrutiny? Well, this theory actually comes from the research of Wilson and Blackett. Now, Wilson and Blackett, you may have heard of them. They were two very controversial researchers. They were active, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, the last few decades of the 20th century, right up until just a few years ago when they both passed away. So they had theories about lots of things to do with this era of history, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. So let's take a look at this theory. So their idea that Mercia was founded by the Vandals is based on three things. So firstly, there's a story called Cilwch and Olwen. This is a Welsh story, part of the Mabinogion. So in this story, Arthur and his men go to Ireland to try to attack and defeat this monstrous boar with its equally monstrous piglets. But it escapes from them and it travels over to South Wales, southwest Wales, and then it starts ravaging Wales as it travels across the country, until finally, when it's above Glamorgan, Arthur gets his men to push it down to the coast, into the Severn, and then it recovers and it travels to Cornwall or Cernil, probably Cernil in southeast Wales actually, and then it is finally defeated once and for all and it disappears into the sea, never to be seen again. So that's the story of Cilwch and Olwen. Now, for a few reasons, Wilson and Blackett identified this event as the same event that Geoffrey of Monmouth described in his Historia Regum Britanniae. So in that record, Geoffrey of Monmouth describes how in the 6th century, a king called Gormund travelled from North Africa to Britain and started ravaging the island there and almost completely devastated it from sea to sea. So this was a major attack and it came from Africa, but the king had a Germanic name, Gormund. So it's quite evident that he's supposed to be a Vandal king because the Vandals were the only notable Germanic peoples who resided in North Africa, especially in that time period. So a 6th century attack from a Germanic king from Africa, evidently that's supposed to be the Vandals. So Geoffrey does clearly describe an attack, an invasion of Britain by the Vandals. Now, as I said, according to Wilson and Blackett, that can be identified as the same event described in Cilwch and Olwen. So in other words, the boar represents the Vandals. Now, part of the reason for this is that in Cilwch and Olwen, Arthur has an ally called Osla Big Knife. He's a Saxon leader. So that's interesting because Arthur famously fought against the Anglo-Saxons, and yet in this story, he's working with Osla to fight against this other common enemy. So Wilson and Blackett present this as being a situation where this other enemy was so frightening to both the Britons and the Saxons that they had to work together to fight against it. So that's really the basis behind the idea that the boar must represent some other enemy far more fearsome than the Anglo-Saxons. So they identify the boar as the Vandals. And this attack, this devastating attack against Wales, is the same as the devastating attack against Britain that Geoffrey of Monmouth described Gormund as engaging in. So that's the fundamental basis for this claim that there's a connection between these two events, that they're actually two different versions of the same story. Now, as for the third element to this theory, it's the connection to Mercia, because Geoffrey of Monmouth doesn't specifically mention Mercia, but the name of the king, Gormund, appears to match, more or less, the name of the ancestor, or one of the ancestors, of the kings of Mercia in the Historia Brittonum. So in the Historia Brittonum, we find various genealogies of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and we find a reference to a certain Gwerdmund as the ancestor of the kings of Mercia. So The idea of Wilson and Blackett is that Gormund, in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, is the same as this Gwerdmund in the ancestry of the kings of Mercia in the Historia Brittonum. And you can see the appeal behind that. They do have very similar names, basically similar enough to be able to identify them as the same person, especially because in this era of medieval writings, spelling wasn't standardized and we find lots of similar alterations of spellings. So there's no real objection to identifying these two people on the basis of their names. They could be the same. So if they were the same, then that would mean that apparently Geoffrey of Monmouth's Gormund, a clearly Vandal leader, was allegedly the ancestor of the kings of Mercia. So that's the basic concept behind this theory, these three elements. The story of Killick being identical to Geoffrey of Monmouth's story of Gwerdmund's invasion, and Gwerdmund being identical to the king of Mercia, the ancestor of the kings of Mercia. Those three elements together form the basis for this theory. But do they stand up to scrutiny? Well, first of all, let's take the identification of the boar in Killick with Gormund in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account. So the idea that this boar represented some great enemy, more fearsome than the Britons and the Saxons, so they had to work together, that's certainly an idea, but it's not really required by what the text actually tells us. So the premise for this idea is the fact that Osler, a Saxon leader, is working with Arthur. So Wilson and Blackett interpret that as being something extraordinary. They actually refer to it as one of the most extraordinary statements in medieval Welsh stories. But is that really so? Well, interestingly, Osler is the Anglo-Saxon leader who's recorded as fighting against Arthur at the Battle of Badon. Now that's interesting because Arthur fought against him at Badon, but in the story of the boar hunt in Killick Osler dies. So it's evident that this story about the boar hunt must be after the Battle of Badon. Otherwise, how could Arthur have fought against Osler if Osler had already died before then in the boar hunt? That's impossible. So it must be the other way around. It must be that the Battle of Badon happened first, then there was this boar hunt. And Arthur won the Battle of Badon. He defeated the Saxons there, which means that Osler, in this story, Killick he's not an independent ruling king allied to Arthur. He is a defeated, deposed ruler. He's subject to Arthur. He's serving Arthur. That's why he's serving Arthur in the story, because Arthur has already defeated him at the Battle of Badon. So it's not that the boar represents some greater threat which requires the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons to work together. Osler's there because he's already lost to Arthur at the Battle of Badon in the past. So now he's serving Arthur as a subject ruler or prisoner or whatever the exact relationship was. And then there's also the issue of the fact that the actual narrative doesn't fit. In Killick the events are set in Arthur's reign. Arthur himself participates in this boar hunt, whereas in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, the invasion by Gormund of Britain occurs after the death of Arthur. It occurs in the reign of Cerdic. Now evidently, when we look at the other British records, we see that Cerdic is Cerdic of Elmet. He was a late 6th century ruler. So the narrative in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account doesn't fit the story of Killick It's set after Arthur's death, explicitly so. Also, there's the fact that the actual sequence of events doesn't fit. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, Gormund is working with the Anglo-Saxons. He exalts them. He gives England to them, basically, after ravaging it. Whereas in Killick after ravaging Wales, Arthur defeats the boar in Cernil, probably Gwent in southeast Wales, and then he's expelled into the sea and he's never seen again. That's what happens. So there's no real connection at all between these two events, between Killick and Geoffrey of Monmouth's account of Gormund. They're not really similar at all. However, that's not necessarily a problem because you've still got these two key elements of Gormund's story, the story of Gormund's invasion, and the presence of apparently Gormund's name in the ancestry of the kings of Mercia. The connection with Killick while interesting, isn't really essential to the theory. The theory can stand on its own without that, with just Geoffrey of Monmouth's story of Gormund and the ancestry of the kings of Mercia. Those two elements could stand together, but do they actually check out? Do they actually stand up to scrutiny? Well, the problem is that when we look closer at the records about the kings of Mercia, and we look outside just the Historia Brittonum, we see that the genealogy presented in the Historia Brittonum is an abbreviated version. When we look at, for example, Anglo-Saxon records, like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, we find that the figure who appears as Gwerdmund in the Historia Brittonum corresponds to a certain Weirmund in the Anglo-Saxon versions. And clearly it is the same name, just a different spelling. But the point is, we can see in this expanded, more fuller version that this figure is far too early to be Gormund. We know when Penda of Mercia was born. He was born at the beginning of the 600s. So when we count back through the generations to get to his ancestor Weirmund or Gwerdmund, we find that this ancestor must have been born probably in the 4th century, whereas Geoffrey of Monmouth's account of Gormund takes place in the 6th century, towards the end of that century. So there is absolutely no chance whatsoever on a chronological basis that Geoffrey's Gormund could be identified as the Gwerdmund from the Historia Brittonum's list of kings of Mercia. There cannot be any connection between them. They lived centuries apart. So that's the key problem. If there's no connection between Gormund and Gwerdmund, then there's simply no connection whatsoever between the Vandals and Mercia. Obviously, the very account itself in Geoffrey of Monmouth's work is open to suspicion because Geoffrey of Monmouth isn't completely historically accurate, and particularly with this account, there's evidence of some confusion with later events in the 9th century or 10th century involving the Vikings. I'll look at that in more detail later, but the point is, we can see clearly that Geoffrey of Monmouth's account of Gormund is clearly confused. So there's no guarantee that he's right at all about there actually having been a Vandal invasion of Britain in the 6th century. And even if there was, there's no basis to connect that to Mercia, because that connection, which Wilson and Blackett promoted, depends on that one single relationship, the identification of Gormund with Gwerdmund. But as we can see, that connection is not valid. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So in answer to the question, was Mercia a Vandal kingdom? My answer would be absolutely not. There is no good evidence for this theory whatsoever. I do agree with some of Wilson and Blackett's ideas, particularly surrounding King Arthur and other things as well, but regarding Mercia, no, I don't think the evidence stands up to scrutiny whatsoever regarding this. Mercia was unusual, but it was just an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Now if, like any reasonable person, you're dying to know the true location of the missing hot spring of the city of Troy, then come back next time for my next video.